Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing another really awesome guest for you today. Just as a little background to today's show, January marks a National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month in the United States and the 100th anniversary of the 1926 Slavery Convention that intended to abolish slavery worldwide. And unfortunately, here in 2026, we still have an extremely large number of people, probably the largest number recorded, currently trapped in modern slavery. And as such, we are honored today to be joined by Dr. Xanthe Scharff, who is the managing director for external affairs and editor-at-large at the Freedom Fund, which is a global fund. They're seeking to end modern slavery, ultimately acting as a catalyst, working in countries and sectors where it's still highly prevalent. And she leads the development and communication efforts of the organization. She also serves as an ambassador for the organization in the United States. Dr. Scharff is a media executive, a nonprofit founder, a journalist. She has a really deep commitment to centering stories and leadership of people at the front lines of this change. Previous to this, she co-founded the Fuller Project, which is a global newsroom dedicated groundbreaking journalism about women while reporting various areas of the world, including Turkey and on the Syrian border back in 2014. And under her leadership, that organization drove really large-scale policy change, won a variety of awards, and investigated various issues, including trafficking and workplace exploitation in areas like Somaliland, Lesotho, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, as well as the UK, Philippines, and Bangladesh. Dr. Scharff is also the founder and board chair emeritus of the organization Advancing Girls Education in Africa, an educational nonprofit that provides scholarship and peer mentoring in Malawi. And she's the former deputy for the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute. They're helping to advance education policies that impacted literally billions of dollars in development spending. Did both her master's and Ph.D. at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, undergrad work down the road at the NYU. And we're honored to have her with us. A lot to get into, some topics we don't normally touch on, but really looking forward to the discussion. Dr. Xanthe Scharff, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Ira. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot to get into. Let's start off about 10 or so years ago. Reading about your bio, you were working at organizations like the United Nations, like the World Bank, Save the Children International. Come 2011, you publish your dissertation per Tufts. And this is entitled Humanitarian and Development Approaches to Education Implications for Conflict Prevention in Somaliland, Northern Uganda. And this dissertation, where you get into dealing with the Lord's Resistance Army and sexual slavery and slavery of children as soldiers. I mean, some of the most horrific, egregious acts of slavery. Take us back a little bit. I'm always interested in how a topic falls into our guest lap for their dissertation, but this one's pretty brutal. And I would love to hear a little bit of sort of how you got started specifically in focusing on this area, because it's really eye-opening. Let's just say what you worked on at this point.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you. You went way back into the archives there.
Yeah.
Yes, that it was a really formative experience, obviously, to work on the issue of child soldiers who were enslaved, women who were enslaved as brides to fighters. And I landed in northern Uganda just about a week after the Ugandan army had pushed the Lord's Resistance Army across the border. So I landed just as that very long-standing, about 20-year war was effectively over, and the government regained control over that territory. But those people who were war affected, had been displaced from their land in camps, horrible, horrible atrocities that were, sometimes were, sometimes the Lord's Resistance Army captured kids and then made them commit atrocities against their families. So really deep trauma. And the thing that was really interesting to learn about and really, informs my worldview is that during the war, the humanitarian aid system kicked into gear and was funding the survival of these individuals in camps with food, with schools in camps. In some cases, access to primary education improved because people were now in camps as opposed to very rural agricultural areas. And when the
Mhm.
war ended, boom, that's over. Humanitarian aid is now over because that aid was defined in such a way that when the war was over, that aid would end. And then development aid would come. But the development aid was very slow to come. And so there was this huge yawning gap as far as how people's needs would be met during that time period because aid was really flowing based on international frameworks and not based on the reality on the ground. And actually, the US government, among the bilateral donors, was doing a better job of being invested on the ground in northern Uganda. But it was a really big structural issue. So I was interviewing people, a lot of people. I spent a lot of time on the ground talking to hundreds of people who sometimes were being kicked out of camps, which they shouldn't have happened, but did. And then going back to their ancestral villages. So going way back home, landing there and telling me, I don't even know how to farm because my parents couldn't teach me how to farm. I don't know how to raise my own food, and there are no schools. So now the education rate for some of those populations was plummeting. You're supposed to get a peace, you go to school, you learn about peace. There's supposed to be a peace dividend at the end of a war, and that's supposed to help promote everyone's commitment to peace, right? But if you have the opposite, it's heartbreaking and really problematic. So I came away from that experience with just an understanding of, these are huge systems. There's huge amount of money. There are these big, big ideas. Sometimes we get advances in the field about how things should go. The money should go to the Ugandan government and they should control it. But the Ugandan government wasn't as committed to solving the problems in the north as they were in some other places. So then how do you solve for that? Maybe it's different in one place as compared to the other.
Yeah, and it's just interesting again because a major part of some of the things that you learn during this work, in terms of the different roles of types of education, in terms of humanitarian education, development education, and so forth. It's interesting because your role is sort of following this, and this will lead up to where we're going in a little bit when we get to the Freedom Fund. But your work with advancing girls' education in Africa, which heavily focused on educating girls and women, and ultimately the societal stability that comes from this. This principle that education, it's more than education. It stabilizes communities, promotes equity, and as we'll get into a lot of the cases per the Freedom Fund in a little while, enrolling children in schools like one of the major solutions that we see in a lot of these different cases. But talk a little bit again about your time here in Malawi and a little bit of what you learned during these experiences as well.
Yeah. Well, I went to Malawi because I wanted to understand grassroots work. I wanted to understand community building work on the ground in Malawi or in the region. And I was fortunate because although it was early in my career, Care Malawi, which was almost entirely staffed by Malawians, gave me the opportunity to go out and do a research project with colleagues where we would go out village by village and understand the impact of a program that had trained women who had not gone to school, but trained them in how to start small businesses. So I was going village to village for a young person interested in international development. This is a dream job. I was
Mhm.
just so happy to get a chance to sit, listen, learn from women about their lives and their experiences. And now I look back on that and I'm just so grateful I was able to have that experience thanks to the colleagues at Care Malawi who just welcomed me and gave me space to learn with them. Um, and they have so much expertise about how to do community development in the right way for their community. Of course, I knew practically nothing. I was coming from graduate school and just really trying to gain some experience. Um, and while I was there, I met a woman named Selena Boniface, and I met her daughter, Anesi. Anesi had dropped out of school at eighth grade. Her older brother was continuing on in 11th grade. And so I interviewed them along with everybody else. And then I got a call from the Christian Science Monitor asking for a story. And the reason they wanted a story from me, their Africa correspondent was busy. I was available. It was 2005. And at that time, Tony Blair and other politicians, but there was a push to forgive debt in Africa and for people to better understand, what it means to be living under the poverty line, which at that time was under $1 a day, meaning you can't you can't eat, you can't survive. And so they wanted a story about life on $1 a day. What does it actually look like? So Selena Boniface was just really dynamic woman. And though I was talking to her through an interpreter, I felt like I had a great connection with her and that she would really explain her life to me. So I went back and I asked her if I could do a story about her family. And in the story, I mentioned Nessie dropped out of school because they couldn't afford to send both kids to school, and their fees, school wasn't free. And they thought the boy was more likely to get a paid job that he would pay back, and support the family in his later years. So that was their choice. That wasn't the focus of the article, but the Christian Science Monitor readers grabbed onto it and they wanted a way to help Nessie. So I think in some ways I was blessed with a healthy amount of ignorance here because I was not an education expert. I was a very eager learner and I really wanted to do good. And these readers wanted to do good. They wanted to send money. And so I put myself in the hands of my Malawian colleagues basically and said, these readers are trying to send me money. Actually, Ira, sometimes it was like they're trying to send me a $20 check to this office in Malawi to take to this community where there's no bank and the Selena is illiterate. Got to figure this out. So my Malawian colleagues were wonderful and they explained to me, okay, here's how this can work. We go to the village, we can't just help this one girl because that will create jealousy. It's really unfair. You just happened upon this family. Let's go to the village chief first. That's protocol. Let's ask for help identifying all the girls in the same situation. And then we find all of them, and then we find a way for the community to to administer a little scholarship fund. And so
Mhm.
that's what we did. And the women had already been organized by CARE, so they became the scholarship community fund managers. And so we started with 6 girls in school. And then the Monitor is an amazing paper. You know, this is one of these legacy papers. It's a Christian publication that's published in conjunction with the Church of Christian Science. That being said, it's much more than a Christian publication in that it's a truly worldly publication where they focus on solutions and moving humanity forward. It's like the show, right? We have enough bad
There we
news.
go.
Right. So the readers, when they saw the picture that I sent of the 6 girls getting ready to go to school, they went crazy. And then I got all these letters and they wanted to send a lot more money. And, I was early in my career, so the amount of money they sent, which was ultimately over a year, was $50,000, which to me was like, hey, wow, this is a huge opportunity to do good. And the editor of the Christian Science Monitor was like, listen, Xanthe, reporters are not NGO people. NGO people are not reporters. You can report for us or you can start an NGO, but you're not going to do both. So it was just really obvious to me that I was going to go start that NGO. And then this wonderful editor who's since passed on, David Hawk, as he said, we'll cover the story every year. We'll send somebody out to cover the story every year. So that's what they did. So I for 10 years, I would say pretty much everything I thought about or did had to do with advancing girls' education in Africa, which was the name that the mothers in that village gave it. So they named it. And it was always really led by Malawian colleagues, whether our country directors, of which we had a few, just brilliant, dynamic women, or sometimes advisors who would just tell, this is the way. Um, and I do my part of raising money, raising awareness, looking at the US funding context and the policies. Um, and at the end of 10 years, I felt like it was time for me to make space for someone else to run the organization and make sure it could run on its own feet. And so that's what I did about 10 years ago.
It's talking about funding and policy, and we'll get to the Freedom Fund right after this. But um, say a couple words about Brookings and the Center for Universal Education, because here you're really advancing policy through a major think tank that's impacting billions of dollars. And we'll also be talking a little while about the unfortunate issues that we're seeing in 2026 in terms of global aid. But some of the learnings from this time, because obviously the first two experiences we're talking about, you're in the field, you're really learning on the ground. Here, like at Brookings, you're mobilizing, tens of billions of dollars in some cases, and World Bank, from these various programs, Education for All. Again, some of the key learnings at this point, and then we'll transition into what's going on for the funds.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, I was at Brookings for 2 years in which I learned a huge amount. I was interested in that job at Brookings, in which I was associate director, sort of like a deputy to the Center for Universal Education, which just means education for people
Mhm.
outside the US in that context. I was interested in it because I was still the board chair of Age Africa, and I wanted to learn more about the global scene and be able to help, channel more resources to Age Africa and kind of deepen my expertise. And that is what happened. And we were working on a very different level. Brookings and the center, which it was founded by Gene Sperling, former U.S. Policy person, and then run by Dr. Rebecca Winthrop, who is a really leading expert on education, and was very strategic. And so we had the ear of the UN Secretary for Global Education, the Global Partnership for Education, which is the huge World Bank Plus group that gives out enormous packages of education aid to countries around the world. And what was interesting, Ira, I think it's really quite fun to look back, right? Because it does give a sense that we have made progress. So, what concerned me when I started Age Africa was that children in Malawi and in other parts of Africa were getting aid, bilateral aid, to get access to primary education, but it was cutting off at the end of primary education. They weren't getting help with secondary education, and they were having to pay out of pocket. So that was cutting off for a lot of families how far they could get their kids. And at Brookings, it was just a different piece of the same puzzle, which is that the international aid system had mobilized with this idea of how do we get the most kids in school in the most cost-effective way with the most
Mhm.
benefit. So, kind of like an economic approach to this,
Uh-huh.
which leads to the idea of lots of kids packed into primary schools. So classrooms with hundreds of kids, 100 elementary kids in a classroom. Like, oh God. And it was, I didn't have kids at the time, or my kids were babies at the time. But now can imagine, right? 7, 8, 9 year olds, 100 kids in a classroom is just crazy. And I do think we've made some progress on that. But that basically the idea is that was access. The idea was it wasn't only about learning, it was also you get them in there, they're safer, you have an automatic correlation with positive development outcomes. Sometimes that means you can do interventions like school feeding or deworming. There are all these
Right.
benefits that you can see in a longitudinal study. However, there was not any science around what the kids are actually learning. or there wasn't
Okay.
great science. Okay, so what are actually their learning outcomes? And so that was the beating heart of the work that we were doing at Brookings with Rebecca's leadership. We mobilized a global task force that could define what learning outcomes look like across different, of course, numeracy and literacy and social emotional learning, all of that, so that the global frameworks could move forward. So we wouldn't just be looking at, butts and seats. So we'd be looking like, are these kids
Right.
learning to read and write and all the things they need? So that felt really important and also did influence global players. And the other piece, which we have made some progress on as well, that going back to Age Africa was around, you know, there's got to be funding to help kids go from primary through secondary education. If you're going to consider the future of future development of countries, right? Getting kids through primary school clearly is not enough. And even if it costs 10 times more to have a kid go through secondary school, there's got to be a way to mobilize that. So we move forward. Hopefully, each decade that passes, and education has moved forward, and more kids are in school, learning better, and getting to higher levels, and many more girls as well, in many places. So, we have made some progress in that arena.
Absolutely. No, I really wanted to sort of lay all the groundwork that you've been involved in the last couple of decades, because I think it's important because it leads up to, a lot of what you're doing now and some of the solutions, of course. But let's talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we mention slavery in 2026, because I've done a couple shows with Bakari Tandia from the Abolition Institute, specifically, which was focused on so-called chattel slavery in Mauritania and sort of this, let's say, older form of enslavement, a la what was happening here in the United States, pre-Emancipation Proclamation and all that. And it's crazy to think that, there's 100,000 people in the world that are still owned by somebody else. In this case of your organization, you define what we're talking about as modern slavery. So you define it on your website as an umbrella term referring to extreme exploitation, human trafficking, bonded and forced labor, child labor, sexual exploitation, enforced marriage, and domestic servitude. So a lot packed in there. Take a little time just to explain how you think of modern slavery in 2026. And again, based on that big, what said at the beginning of this episode, that the highest number of people in 2026 are currently recorded trapped in one of these systems. Love to understand why, and
Yeah.
we'll go from there.
Yeah. Thanks, Ira. Yeah. Starting with the definition is a great place to start. So, modern slavery, the idea of using the word modern is to distinguish it from what people associate with the word slavery, which is, like you said, the horrible history that we have in the United States and other parts of the world of ownership and even legal ownership. And modern slavery, which is a concept that was developed a couple decades ago, including by an author named Kevin Bales. The idea is it's not about having a piece of paper and saying I own this person. It's actually about coercion and control and ways in which one person benefit off of another person while not allowing that person to exercise their freedoms.
Mhm.
And so I will say that I think that it does take some time for people to understand what we mean when we're using these words because it's an umbrella term and it includes a range of different things. And each of those things can also be a bit complicated. But when we talk about 50 million people in modern slavery today, which is a figure, that figure comes from studies done by the International Labor Organization in partnership with Walk Free, which is one of the partners of Freedom Fund. So they do
Yep.
this really important piece of research showing 50 million people, highest number in history. In fact, computes to 1 in 150 people. So just let that sink in.
Right.
It is more than half of that is forced labor, and within forced labor is sex trafficking. Just under half of that is child marriage. So, child marriage, I'll spend a moment on child marriage because Child marriage, the way that they look at that is when they're self-reporting and the person says that they've been forced into marriage. It's a little
Hmm.
bit murky and the number is probably higher than that because if you consider that somebody under 18 or under 16, depending on the law in the country that you're in, can't actually make a decision to get married, they're not an adult, then the
Right.
number could be higher.
Hmm.
So, within forced labor, big percent, probably about 40% of those folks are women.
Okay.
And it's a misconception that more of that is sex trafficking. Actually, more of it is still labor trafficking for women, but a huge portion of it is sex trafficking as well. So we've got all these different things going on. Now, within forced labor itself, you mentioned a couple different terms. So you did some of my work for me, Ira. um, I can tell you a little bit more about how we work on these different pieces. So yes, there is bonded labor, where someone's told, um, you have to keep working here because you had to purchase this set of tools and I'm charging you interest on these tools and you owe me this and you cannot leave until you pay this off and this person will never pay it off. Or they have a bad agricultural season, they need a loan to survive, they never pay it off, right? Sometimes this can be intergenerational. So for instance, Freedom Fund works in Nepal and has worked really closely with a group of people called the Harwa Charwa, who are a member of what's known as a scheduled caste or sort of societally speaking, there's an idea that people of this group should be treated in a certain way. They're agricultural workers or people who work with cattle.
Yep.
And they're in these forms of intergenerational, they cannot get out and they're dependent on the landholder, actually. So they also don't have anywhere to go. We've worked really closely with these folks. I'll tell you more about it if we want to go into detail, but
Yeah.
actually, we've worked really closely to help them organize themselves to demand their own freedom and had a huge win with the prime minister issuing a formal declaration of their freedom. So they are recognized as free. The work continues to help them access alternative forms of employment because for so many years of oppression and lack of access to education and that sort of thing, there's a lot of rehabilitation to
Yeah.
do. But that's ongoing work. The other couple things worth mentioning, domestic servitude is also something that we work on. So in Ethiopia, for example, we have worked with women who have signed up and then gone to the Middle East to work as nannies and cleaners, only to find upon arrival their passports are confiscated. They don't have any right to change employer. They have no means of communication. They're not getting proper wages. They're working around the clock. They're subject to abuse. And so we've worked for a long time in Ethiopia to help actually not just individuals, but also system change so
Hmm.
that there's monitoring systems in place that it's not only happening in Ethiopia, this is also something that's been reported on coming out of Kenya, Philippines, etc. So domestic servitude, much lesser known, Ira, is the issue of extreme forms of child domestic work in the home. So the child
Yeah.
labor that's happening in homes oftentimes can take the form of um, a girl whose family's from a rural area, maybe a cousin or distant relative, promises to take her into the more urban area and get her to school, but they don't send her to school. And they basically are enslaving her in the home to cook and clean and she's getting abused or so in these extreme cases um, we consider that a form of modern slavery.
Hmm.
um, so that just gives you a sense. There's a lot to understand. There's a lot going on, but the one simplifying thing that we know at Freedom Fund is that what always is important and always works is listening to the people in the communities and often the survivors who are leaders who actually know how to break these chains. They know how to empower people to fight for their rights, to organize, to work with governments, to promote the proper legal responses, sometimes to sue. There's a range of strategies that they
Sure.
know how to take up. Yeah.
Hmm. And along those lines, can you just talk a little bit because I know you have quite a international set of benefactors there, from the U.S., many private foundations, the Department of State, and so forth. But then investors from the UK, Australia, Switzerland, Norway, their Agency for Development Cooperation, and so forth. Just say a few words, if you would, about the organization itself as Freedom
Yeah.
Fund, and a little bit of how it when and how it was initially set up.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for the chance to talk about Freedom Fund. It's a really special place. We are what's called a collaborative fund, which is in a way a newer concept within development. It's where donors are getting together and pooling their resources so that they come together around a shared mission. And then the fund, we fundraise as well. But because we have donors who helped us get started, we have a strong corpus. So that
Right.
allows us, it's a buffer against risk. It lets us be more effective, and it lets us welcome in new donors who are sometimes early in their journey and would really like to join with a community of philanthropists who share this mission of ending modern slavery. So we were started, we had three founders. One I mentioned, Walk Free. And so that's the Forrest family out of Australia. Um, Also, Humanity United, which is funded by Pam and Pierre Omidyar. Um, and then a group called Legatum, which is very interesting, investment firm based in Dubai, with international partners, including based out of London as well as Dubai. And Legatum has a particular philosophy, which is that even as they earn, they should be giving back and doing good. And they've started several funds. So they started Freedom Fund with these other founders, but they've also started another fund called the End Fund to deal with tropical diseases. And they've also started a fund for education. And then most recently, they've started a fund for humanitarian aid. So they enjoy this model of collaborative funds. The thing that really unites all of our founders is this idea that the people on the front lines deserve to have these resources because they know what to do. And so our responsibility is to raise as much money as we can and to be as lean as we can so that we get that money out to them really efficiently and then platform them, raise up their profile and their voices however we can.
Let's if you don't mind, let's drill down on a couple of these examples just to further explain to our audience what's going on here, and ultimately some of the solutions that you're creating. And we can talk about Hawara Chawara,
Yeah.
that you mentioned before in Nepal, and this is a an example of agricultural bonded labor, again, where someone is forced to repay this, in some cases, deceptive debt. It's too big. Not only will they never be able to pay it, but their families will ultimately be trapped afterwards. So it becomes a generation long thing. Again, say a couple words about this in terms of some of the solutions, in terms of obviously education plays a major
Yeah.
role here, legal assistance. But it also mentioned, it was reading, was it 2022, that the government of Nepal sort of gets involved in helping out in terms of trying to liberate these communities. What is the role of, I mean, obviously some of these local governments know this stuff's happening. What's your experience in terms of, when they get involved? I mean, is this legitimate? I mean, is it real? What's that all about?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. You know, it's tricky working with governments
Yeah,
because
right.
people change, administrations change, priorities change, all of those things. That being said, we all know that in the nonprofit space, we're relatively small actors compared to government and, private sector writ large. Really, we're here to catalyze, to incentivize, to innovate, to hold accountable. And when we do those things that are otherwise not going to get done, but then we manage to bring in the government, we are punching very far above our weight. So it is definitely a goal for a lot of nonprofits to get the government's attention and to get them to act. And so I think the tricky thing, and this is the work of lobbyists and the work of advocacy folks, like, you got to know who you can work with.
Right.
And I think it's always true that in any big body, government or anywhere else, people have mixed motives, but you can often find some really good, committed people. So
Mhm.
I think our I would say what I've observed is that folks are pretty smart. You know, if the emphasis is on the local government, work with the local government. You know, if there's an opening to work with federal government and they're inviting you in, you know. So I guess I could give an example in Brazil,
Okay.
um, which is we've got a program in the Amazon. And in the Amazon, folks are very aware of the issues of the Amazon being deforested. We've got a lot of attention to that, and it's happening at a very rapid rate. And there are folks working on that, and there are some solutions that are well known, including indigenous ownership over the land, which helps to protect the land. But Freedom Fund is the only organization, as I understand it, that's working at the issue of forced labor and deforestation at that intersection.
Yep.
What's happening is that laborers are being recruited, tricked, captured, kept, mistreated, abused in order to deforest the Amazon because it's so incredibly lucrative. It is so lucrative because you can
Mm.
sell the timber and then also you can have cattle. And Brazil is either the first or the second largest exporter of cattle, both the meat and also the leather, you know, are really important. So it's so valuable to do this work that there are organized lobbies that capture political interest, right? And that's legal. But there is
Mm.
also illegal. There is also illegal activity. There's both. There's a combination of things. Now, it just really depends on your political perspective, but Brazil does have a constitution which protects the Amazon. So one perspective is that all of the destruction of the Amazon is problematic and shady on some level.
Right.
But there is also just clearly illegal activity that everybody can agree. This is just illegal activity. This land is protected. This should not be allowed. Now, our partners, so when we work in a country, we have our country-based from that country experts who are running the program. We have small program staffs, you know, they're re-granting money out, right? So they aren't running programs. And we have a number of partners in the Amazon, and they're at sort of different stages of like, you know, some of them are very grassroots. And
Mm.
so one of those partners, the woman running partner is she's got a network of folks throughout the Amazon, and they look out for and spot when they can see that there's illegal deforestation happening. They can see it because big machines start coming in and they're lighting fires,
Right.
and things like that. So it's very dangerous to confront illegal elements, right? It's very, you don't want to just go up and walk up to these folks, right? These are dangerous
Right.
individuals, maybe connected to organized crime and things like that. So she called our program director and they work out a plan together. Now, the reason why they are able to then contact the government and mobilize the government to take action against this is because they have already spent the time to talk to all of these different departments, you know, like us, could be the Park Service, Homeland Security, it could be FBI, who knows? You could be talking to lots of different agencies if you were trying to alert people to this kind of, you know, crime against federally protected areas. So they have the relationships, they help to mobilize, they're giving the reports, and the government did, in fact, do a raid. And they were able to push these folks running, you know, hightailing out of the forest and to rescue about 50 individuals who were in terrible shape, you know, and then to provide them, you can imagine all the follow-on services that have to happen. The thing that's interesting about this is so clearly you've got some motivated people in the government who want to do good. They had to go through a lot of hoops to make that happen, of course, right? But they didn't actually have the ways of working. You know, that's it. They're not doing, you know, so many raids that this is like an everyday kind of thing. They need help from civil society to push and connect the dots, give the report, and that sort of thing. So, you know, in the Amazon, what I've learned is that the number of rescue raids in recent years has been around under 30,000, but estimates of how many people are enslaved up at a million. So
Mm.
you get the idea. This is a huge problem. The government is not necessarily that well equipped to deal with it. There are
Mm.
people who don't want to deal with it, but there are people who really do. So when we can push, you know, in a constructive way, things can happen. Kind of a squeaky wheel thing. So Sometimes, I mean, we're not a lobbying organization or anything like that, but sometimes our partners are sounding the alarm. Sometimes they're exposing malfeasance. Sometimes they're going to the government and they're saying, "Hey, I saw this. Let me share some expertise with you about what we've seen other governments do." So,
Yeah, it's a very interesting example. I mean, it got me thinking. It was a couple of years ago now. One of the people I hosted on the show was a young lady by the name of Namanti Nakimo, and she's a local, an indigenous member of the Warani tribe. She actually went to law school to battle the oil companies and everything, but she herself was trafficked along the way. And, this was up the river in Ecuador now. But
mm,
yeah, rather horrific story. And again, it's sort of, it fits in with what you're talking about. It just gets me thinking, whether it's this type of circumstance or what you, again, going back to your dissertation, thinking about Uganda and that form of sexual trafficking. I mean, anything that you get involved in or see on sort of um, the trauma recovery side of this, because clearly, when we're talking about this, we've also talked about things like
yeah.
victims of torture and so forth on the show. I mean, what's happening on that front? Are there things happening? Because there's clearly a seriously damaged, traumatized population here, whether it's, forced labor, or whether it's,
Yeah.
these more horrific areas. What are you seeing on that front? And is Freedom Fund getting involved in ultimately how we rehabilitate people that have been in
Yeah.
these horrible systems?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, Ira, you're a kindred soul to the Freedom Fund because rehabilitation and prevention. That if we're going to talk about where is the work, let's put a
Yeah,
lot of attention on prevention and rehabilitation, right? I think we need to talk about those things. Um, Unfortunately, I think a lot of attention or goes to the very worst moment, right? So like there's a very worst moment where a person is trafficked, there's a perpetrator, and that is what tends to get people's attention, right? That's when you see a news story, that's usually what it's going to be about, is about this horrible moment. If you
yeah,
think about like that, of course, the Epstein coverage is shocking and outrageous, and you're seeing this, huge juxtaposition of a powerful, famous person and young, extraordinarily
yeah,
vulnerable girls, and it being swept under the rug. Um, so we need to pay attention to these things. We need to pay attention to prosecution. These are important ways of raising awareness, and people get really upset when they hear about these abuses. But sometimes their attention, if I at least speak from like a fundraising or communications perspective, sometimes that attention doesn't stay with us as long as we need it because actually what we're
yeah,
trying to do is preventing these things from happening in the first place. And it's a little harder to get people's attention to how you can prevent, how you can work really long term in communities. I'll say more specifically on the rehabilitation side. Um, Rehabilitation and prevention, actually. I just had an amazing call with our team talking about our work in Bangladesh. And
okay,
so in Bangladesh, and you probably know Ira from your chats with folks around the world, um, there's just a huge amount of prostitution, but also within the prostitution, a lot of trafficking that's taking place.
yeah,
Status of women is very low. And so that is kind of a setup for those conditions. And um, now I have not yet been to Bangladesh. I hope to go visit our program, but I started a newsroom called the Fuller Project, focused on women.
yeah,
And so I vicariously learned through one of our reporters, Corinne Redfern, who spent years reporting in the brothels in Bangladesh. And so spent a lot of time reading about and talking to her about the conditions there. And in some of these brothels are like brothel cities, and these are huge
yeah,
areas. Um, and they have their kind of own logic. But really heartbreaking things. Like, it was some years ago that Corinne reported on the first uh, woman working in a brothel who was allowed to be buried because they were not allowed to be buried in proper funeral grounds because of the stigma. So the call that I had was very uplifting because I was hearing from the team how they did work to get children birth certificates. So I'm going to connect all these dots, Ira, as we get back to the idea of prevention, um,
Mm,
because the law was stating that to have a birth certificate, you need a father's signature. So naturally, the women in the brothels, when they have children, they don't know who the father is. They don't have a father's signature. So the children were undocumented, which means
mm,
no access to education, no
mm,
access if you would be getting a subsidy for food. Nope. You're not getting help. You're not getting anything. You're not getting any monitoring or protection either, right? So these are extremely vulnerable kids. The girls, especially, I mean, not exclusively, but the girls are very vulnerable to grooming starting from 8, 9, 10, to be, brought into the work in the brothels. And if they have no birth certificate, then it's very easy to fake their ages as well. Because as of 18, then they would be, then they're no longer children under that protection. So
mm,
this initiative actually took steam for a couple of reasons. One, Freedom Fund funded some research done by the UN to make it clear that lack of ID is a huge risk factor for trafficking. And they knew to do that in part because they brought survivors into the conversation and survivors explained this issue. And then they went and did the research to show exactly how all of this transpires in different locations, not
mm,
just Bangladesh. Now, the exciting thing is that one of our partners discovered that there was a sort of loophole in Bangladeshi law, a decree that hadn't normally been followed that would allow for a different way to register the child without the father. And they shared it with all the partners. We have 9 partners in Bangladesh. Now they are all using this degree in order to register children. They've registered over 200 children from inside those brothels. So they will receive, this is a really important form of protection for them. Um, Now, going further down their sort of life cycle, sometimes what's happening is that the mothers are telling our partners that they want help getting their daughters out of the brothels. So
yeah.
the daughters will go to a shelter and the mothers may be asking that the daughter is taken to another family member elsewhere or another guardian. Sometimes these shelters will do that level of kind of social service coordination to actually get the daughter out, away, so that there's no vulnerability to, or well, reduced vulnerability to grooming from inside that community. And these shelters do everything. These are the people running the shelter. These are the women who are thinking about every need that these kids have, whether it's legal services, whether it's taking care of them, physically, emotionally, mentally, education, vocational education, all the things that they need. So they have a wide suite of kind of tools, of ways of working with kids. And those legal cases sometimes then can be connected up to bigger, national advocacy work too.
Yeah, along these, I mean, it's an awesome example again of an integrative sort of prevention strategy. The other one I find kind of interesting. We could say a few words about this. It was in the material about your work in Ethiopia, specifically on these anti-trafficking school clubs, which from I tried to read a little bit about this, that there's quite a few of these in schools all over Ethiopia now, and they've done a pretty good job. I mean, they kind of equate to the clubs we have here to, but keep kids after school. They don't get them out in gangs and all that. But it seems like this is an interesting approach that seems to me, let's say, down 35% reduction in dropout rates, and ultimately, which could lead to problems that lead to irregular migration and all the issues seen in Ethiopia. But can you say a couple words about anti-trafficking school clubs?
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of the innovations of our local partners.
Yeah.
And these are local partners who also listen to the kids, and the kids are telling them what they need. And I think that's the beauty of this. Like, sometimes I get invited onto shows and people are like, Xanthe, how do you solve this problem? I'm like, well, actually, I don't know. Who knows is the person who started that club. Because, of
Yeah.
course, it's just different. It's going to be different in every situation, every context, what these kids need. So, the clubs, that's one innovation, something that we love. We love to hear these stories and these approaches, is that in some of the work in Africa and Ethiopia and Kenya, partners have gotten, okay, it's a little complicated. In a household where a child is in exploitative child domestic work, there are usually other children, right? The head of
Hmm.
household, we can call them the employer. It's not really the right term, but the head of household who is overseeing this child worker, that head of household usually has a child too. And so our partners have involved that child, the child of the head of household. And that is actually very effective because
Makes sense.
you have children care about fairness. I mean, you try to give one kid one thing more than the other kid. Oh, no, that
Yeah.
cannot, no, absolutely not, right? From a very young age, they have a sense of justice. It's just baked in. And so those kids have talked to their parents actually to say, I'm not really understanding why this kid has to eat alone and does all of the work, isn't getting to sleep, isn't getting to school. Isn't there some other way? So these dialogues, I mean, these are, you know, if you're not from that culture, you can't do that work, right? I mean, people like you and me, we can raise awareness, we can raise money, we can help maybe, to document or to interview and like lift up really important practices and those practices can be taken to other places and tested out. And the best of that might be applicable and it might not be, right? Um, but it's really beautiful to hear what comes up, when we just give people just get them the money. And then, sometimes we can help with connecting like-minded folks, supporting the movement as an ecosystem, as a movement, so that, a legal aid clinic, can connect up. Maybe there's global lawsuit going on, and maybe a local union has some folks who've been wronged, and it's a multinational company, and we connect them. We can do good that way at local level and global level. I think you know, we have the capacity to open some doors, right? But the real work is often face-to-face relationships, listening, making adjustments, making sure that people's voices are heard.
Like every little piece, counts in these situations. So no, I get it's commendable, and of these different approaches, and then obviously there's not going to be one that's standardized, but clearly you're having an impact. So that's extremely impressive. Xanthe, again, we mentioned a little bit about the global aid situation, especially in terms of USAID and what we're seeing internationally now. Talk a little bit about ultimately how the loss of literally billions is impacting what you do, the global scene on that front, and then at the same time, I mean, on a positive note, you got this extremely large gift from Mackenzie Scott recently of $60 million. That's awesome. And tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about some of the plans for 2026 in terms of that new sort of money
Thank you.
inflow. Yeah.
Yeah, I cannot even begin to express just how joyful it was for us to get that gift. I mean, world's most important trust-based philanthropist. And we think, it's all very mysterious, right? Because famously, we have no contact with her. We have no feedback. We don't, we can only guess, but we think she really believes in the front lines, and so we think that is really the big motivator there. Um, so yeah, we received a large and a second gift from her. Actually, we had a first gift in
Hmm.
2021. Now, because we had that gift in 2021, we were spending it down, but we still had some of those reserves. When there was the aid freeze in March, a lot of organizations collapsed. And we do have significant US funding, and that funding is directed to certain countries. And so we were able to say to all of our partners that we will back the commitments, even if we don't know if it's coming back from the USG, at least to keep things going, we'll back it. And in many cases, they told us we were the only funder of theirs in the position to do that. So it does show you the role of this trust-based philanthropy, where the philanthropist has said, I've done my due diligence and I trust you. Now deploy it in the way that you need to, because we had to make that decision overnight. That was a very fast decision. So, now with this second gift, the really exciting thing is that Freedom Fund was in a great position because we already have our strategy. So our strategy is push the money to the front lines. So when the money came in, we were able to decide very, very quickly how to use it. And I've already seen the numbers for the additional spending that we're going to be doing this year, and it's all hotspots. That's what we call the country pro. It's going to the countries. It's going to the grants for our partners. It's just going, to fund the programmatic work and just ramp that up. And that's been really exciting. So, seeing work flourish immediately from this really generous gift. And we will spend it down over 9 years. That's our plan right now. Assuming our projections hold, we decided, I think our CEO is quite deliberative and brave, and with the board and everyone, we decided this is definitely not something we're going to just hold on to and earn investment income off of forever and become a perpetuity kind of place.
Sure.
She gave us this money to get it to the front lines. We're going to get it to the front lines as quickly as we can. That is responsible because when we go into a country, we typically will want to be there for 10 years. So stretch it a little bit so that we can plan and adjust as we need to, and also ramp up our fundraising so that, we're going to increase our regranting. So ramp up our fundraising to meet that higher level over 9 years. So that's my job with my team. But you know, I'm sure you've had guests talk about the impact of the aid cuts. I mean, it is devastating. It's not just the US, it's also a lot of other governments around the world that are investing in their own security and their own people and pulling back. There are still governments, we do still have some funding going right now with the US and some others. And everyone's doing the best that they can. Of course, this has an impact on trafficking. When people don't have food and don't have medical, and when they're desperate, that's when trafficking flourishes. That's one part of it. That's one of the reasons why trafficking flourishes. It also flourishes because of climate disaster, increased migration that's forced, unwanted, when people don't want to migrate, but they have to, they're at 3 times the risk of trafficking.
Mm,
And so there's that. And then there is also the other huge factor, which is just globalization. You know,
right.
the way that our very intricate supply chains are organized, the difficulty of getting information, and also the weak can't even call it a regulatory framework. I mean, these are not mandatory regulatory frameworks for the most part. For the most part, corporations are doing a voluntary form of due diligence, which doesn't have teeth, and the money is just not getting to the groups that actually have teeth. The
Mhm.
frontline human rights defenders, the journalists, they have a pittance of money compared to the amount
Yeah.
of money that I just talked to the author of a Swedewatch report, Ben Clayson, and his report showed that the ESG, environmental social government assessment market that companies use to show that they are sort of clean and clear, um,
Hmm.
it is worth 80 times more money, or 11 billion plus, than the amount of money that gets to the human rights defenders who work on these kinds of issues. So 80 times more. But also the amount of money that's getting to actual like community organizers is a tiny fraction. I'm a tiny fraction of that. So there's a lot of good room to do in that arena as well. And that's also something that, Freedom Fund works on. There's some progress in the UK and the UN towards actual regulatory mandatory frameworks that take time to come into effect, but a lot of folks working to improve that as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's I mean, it's awesome that you're capable of existing and getting funded at this level. Yeah, it makes me think of because one of the people we had on the show was Ambassador Song, who heads up PEPFAR or headed up PEPFAR, and major cuts there in terms of HIV, and
Yeah,
again, this is deadly intersection there in terms of
absolutely.
sex trafficking, disease, and ultimately migration. And yeah, so I mean, yeah, there's a lot of negatives, but it's it's a great sign, and it's that you're able to move things forward in this context and exist for the next 9 years and fund these hotspots. Anything else coming up that we should know about as we get into the first couple months of 2026? Other public facing initiatives that I did not touch on, or conferences, talks, other public facing things that people may run into you and meet you at some point on the circuit out there. What else is happening we should know about?
Yeah, yeah, lots going on. Thank you, Ira. I mean, love for folks to check into our social medias because LinkedIn, Freedom Fund, just look for Freedom Fund on LinkedIn or on Instagram. Um, we do have what's probably the most comprehensive effort to collate the research that is available in terms of fighting modern slavery. We produce a research bulletin every month, so you can sign up for that on our webpage at freedomfund.org.
Hmm.
We also produce an extraordinary amount of research. We've probably done 200 research reports and almost 30 prevalence studies. And these reports just have a huge amount of practical, practitioner focused information, but not only unique to our field, also how to measure movement building. And for folks who are thinking about this stuff, there's a lot available. Um, as far as, this month, our team is very active. So staying with our channels, you'll hear a lot from us and my various colleagues. Certainly as we lead into Women's Month, everything that we do, women are playing a huge role. Whether it's, we talked a little bit about Kenya, Ethiopia, child domestic workers, we were very often girls. Bangladesh, we talked a lot about.
Hmm.
The Amazon, and a lot of women's leadership on these programs. We also work to stop commercial sexual exploitation of children in another region of Brazil, in Recife. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so lots going on all of those efforts. Being that it is the 100-year anniversary of the Anti-Slavery Convention signed at the League of Nations,
Hmm.
there will also be some events, especially around UN General Assembly in September. So it's a really important year. In the States, it's also the 25-year anniversary of really important legislation against trafficking and to protect victims. So there's a lot of conversations going on in Washington, D.C. in particular as well on those
Hmm.
topics.
Well, we will help you get the word out there. I look forward to continue to follow you, the organization, all the extremely important work you're doing. But it's really inspiring what you do, and really wishing you and the team the best with it. Again, for everybody out there that is going to be listening to this episode across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on the YouTube channel, you've been spending time with Dr. Xanthe Scharff, Managing Director for External Affairs and Editor at Large, the Freedom Fund, seeking to ultimately develop a world that is free of slavery. Xanthe, again, want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come here and educate us on an extremely important topic. Thank you for everything you do. And as we like to say here on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow by eliminating this scourge from our planet. Really great having you, and I look forward to continue to follow your work.
Thank you so much, Ira. Thanks for making this space for conversations about moving forward.
Awesome having you. Be
All right,
well.
take care. Bye.